All right, you are here with the Breath of Fresh Air podcast. My name is Zach, and I have a very special guest here today. Want to introduce yourself real fast?
Yeah, I'm Gavin. I'm from faraway England. Well, actually, I'm from Scotland, but I live in England. And I'm here to, as I understand it, tell Zach why he's wrong about everything.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background? You teach at Oxford.
So I don't want to big myself up too much. Uh, I do teaching there. I also do some stuff in London. I guess as often with these institutions, you have lots of independent researchers, independent lecturers, and so on. The Oxford system is different from the sort of universities you'll be familiar with,
Right.
in that it works with a thing called a tutorial system, which means every student, well, most students get a sort of one-on-one or two or three on one hour a week with a tutor on a text, which they have to prepare an essay for every week. It's a very intense
Mhm.
method. So there's a lot of people who do that. Uh, and that's one of the sorts of things that I spend my time doing when I'm not talking to people about obscure philosophical topics. I'm reading about obscure philosophical topics,
All right.
and that's kind of what that's how I make what I guess you can call a living.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. Do you have any? I guess to have the listeners become more familiar with you. Do you have any areas of specialty, or is it more kind of just a broad overlay of philosophy, history, religion, things like that?
Um, well, the stuff I mean, you and I have discussed previously, it tends to focus on religion and religious ideas. And I'm definitely weighted in that direction, or have been for a lot of time. The philosopher I'm probably most interested in, I do most of my work with, is Nietzsche, and in particular Nietzsche and Christianity, but all of Nietzsche. And I'm also particularly developing an interest in Chinese philosophy, and things like Confucius and things like Taoism and so on. Um, I guess you could say I'm a sort of old-fashioned ethics sort of person, and the idea of the good life, the Stoics, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, Philosophy understood as a way of life, something that leads you towards a state of happiness or blessedness or beatitude or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
That's the sort of stuff I do, rather than odd things about how the universe exists. Although I do have some interest in that, or things like uh, the ethics of particular actions. I don't really care if something's good or bad in some ways. And things like free will, I don't really care about. Um, yeah, so that's what I do. I'm a bit old-fashioned.
Gotcha. Awesome. Awesome. So today, I guess we're going to be kind of wrestling with the idea uh, of what is God and what is then the meaning of life. I guess these are two big, very profound questions, and hopefully we'll be able to offer the listeners here some different perspective on those two things, as far as at least how most people commonly see them. I think the God issue really gets easily broken down to a Christian perspective versus a modern atheist, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris perspective, and I think both of us can agree there are so many more perspectives on a creator and on deity than just those two.
Mm.
And then the meaning of life is something that I think almost is there was the reverse problem. I think everyone can sort of derive their own meaning in a very postmodern idea, but I guess I'm going to propose various arguments, and they're going to be arguments that other people much smarter than I have proposed before me, that the best ones, or the ones the ones there are meanings in life that if you align your life with it, whether you like it or not, your life ends up being better,
Mm,
or turns out a lot better in the end, whether you want to admit it in the beginning or not. If you play it out, if you play the drama of the ideas I'm going to kind of lay forward here out, your life ends up being a lot better. Whereas there are a lot of different things that people try to find meaning in that end up leaving them very empty and shallow and void in the end, and left with more questions than answers. Um, so so yeah. So I guess we'll dive into it. I guess my idea, because well, a little bit of background on me. I went to private Christian school, kindergarten through eighth grade, so I was very heavily indoctrinated with a conservative Lutheran background, learning memory work and being indoctrinated with the Bible and the Protestant ideas of Christianity from a very early age. And my father, being a little bit of, he's been on a few of the podcasts, Jay, being the heretic he is, uh, dared to show me other things. Examples being like Egyptian mythology, Atlantis. He kind of instilled in me early on a very curious mind about the mysteries of life. And very early on, I noticed how this doesn't really line up with a lot of the stuff that's in the Bible. So I began to question a lot of things and give my parochial school teachers headaches. So that led me to early on study a lot of these world religions. I think I read the Quran, the Vedas, the Yasna, and the Bible cover to cover, and the Talmud before I went into my freshman year of high school. And looking back, I realized how shocking that might have been. I'm kind of like patting myself. I will definitely pat myself on the back. I don't know a lot of people that read all those heavy texts at such an early age, at 12, 13, 14, however old I was. I think it had to be like 14. And so, I've been pondering these ideas for a long time and kind of looking for answers, and also along the way, kind of understanding how other people come to the conclusions that they come to, and why they understand or try to understand the world the way they do and how they perceive it. Um, in the end, to kind of cut to the chase, I really think that what is God is something like an infinite potential that everything in the universe is reaching towards. And I think there's a lot of biological evidence for that. There is a lot of psychological evidence for that, and there is a lot of metaphysical evidence for that. And I think it sort of supersedes the whole Christianity versus Dawkins baloney, because I think a definition of God, I think the common definition of God is something like a Zeus, something like an old man in the clouds that if you do wrong will hurl lightning bolts at you. You know, it's like the white pearly clouds will turn into storm clouds, and he'll get mad and hurl his fire and brimstone down, etc. And I think that more people nowadays are sort of reaching this new age yuppie version of it's something that embodies something more like the Force from Star Wars, if you will. It's sort of like it's like an energy that transcends all things. And so I think to better put a finger on that, um, is to say that God is what everything in the universe is sort of subservient to. It's what everything in the universe is looking up towards, and it lives and exists within everything, yet it is not everything, right? It's an infinite potential. It's the infinite potential that every single thing in the universe can become, but never will. Um, and in some way, will sort of chase that. So I'll kind of better lay out the argument as I go here, but I guess one good example is I take a feather out of the Jordan Peterson cap quite a bit with a lot of his evidence for value. And he uses dominance hierarchies to kind of explain some of that. And he'll often quote crustaceans and lobsters and how the serotonin system is something that is this ancient system that's like 400 million years old, and it's survived. It's something that is common between us and crustaceans. Another thing, which is later on, because crustaceans are older than trees, but we're all familiar with trees, and I think we all see trees as something that is far older than us. I don't think when we look at lobsters we think old, even though that they are very old. I think when we look at trees we think old, from a more of a perceptual basis, population perceptual basis. And when you look at trees, in every forest, there's a few trees that reach above all the rest. And it's sort of it's like this idea of value or hierarchy is mirrored in society, or it's mirrored in all of biology. Sorry, not society. It's mirrored in all of biology, and it's something that politically I think we dispense with it at a great peril. But not only is this sort of value system, and I think largely that is akin to what would be the top of those value systems, is something that is reaching towards an infinitely potential better version of itself, right? Something like a self-actualized tree is the tallest tree. Something like the self-actualized lobster is the one that dominates all the other lobsters. And it's this is kind of a very simple way to describe it. I don't mean to make it sound like it's, survival of the fittest, but to a degree there is some truth in that, and that is something that has governed biology on this planet for a very long time. So it's not that that's entirely my argument, because I think it goes beyond something, a little bit beyond something like that, but that does describe a large chunk of it. Um, and so, but everything is sort of is looking up to that, or wants to, where we all seek these different ideals that we aspire to be like, and reach towards. And I think that but the neat part about it is this is also sort of reflected in the cosmic. And according to, now this is where we can kind of dive into a little bit of a gray area, because what I laid out with trees and crustaceans is pretty black and white, scientifically speaking and objectively speaking. But the star stuff, I think it was what, 600 years ago we thought the solar system revolved around the Earth. So I don't want to. I purport this as something that I think is very true, but nothing is absolute, right? So I always want to leave there some wiggle room there for new evidence to come out and either support or deter some of these theories. But as far as what we know, cosmically, and from astrophysicists and astronomers and whatnot, the vast majority of the mass in the universe is held within like less than 1% of the stars that exist, or the stars that we can see. And maybe a better way to kind of view some of this is gravity. Black holes are a great example of this. Gravity is something like everything that is smaller being attracted and pulled in towards something that is greater than itself, right? That is essentially the crux of gravity. And so I think there are these cosmic laws, there are these biological manifestations of a phenomena that is something like everything in life reaching towards an infinite potential. And I would call that infinite potential the true God, not some sort of caricature. But I think the characters also help, and we can dive in a little bit into that maybe a little later on. But I guess that's sort of the case I'm laying out, is that the true God, or something like what God really is, if you really want to describe that old man in the clouds, or that you pray to, or you want to really describe something akin to this yuppie new age force like thing, I think that might be the one of the best ways we can kind of put our finger on something that we will never be able to touch. So
Yeah. So I think basically what you're saying is you're a Hegelian, um, uh, and Hegel is a perfectly respectable person to base one's life on. Um, I mean, the ideas you seem to have is that everything which exists exists within a context of progress. Things
Yeah.
grow towards particular end, things get better. Um, we have the ability to discriminate between two of the same kind of thing and say one's better than the other. One has achieved its essence or whatever more than the other, right?
Right. I think evolution has been a large, just a giant, however many hundreds of millions or billions of years of evidence of that. I think there's been hundreds of millions, if not billions of years of trial and error, and the things that work or the things that are more true last, and the things that don't work or the things that are failed experiments sort of die off, right? And they don't. And it's constantly evolution constantly has to make those mistakes, but it is constantly adding on to something like a giant memory bank of experiments that succeeded, right? So it's constantly making experiments that fail, but it's constantly adding on to experiments that succeeded, and that's something like instinct. That's something like tradition. That's something like everything that came before you, all the way back to that first amoeba, right? And so obviously I would make the argument that as human beings we are far above things like amphibians, reptilians, amoebas, crustaceans, etc.,
Mhm.
etc. We have disposable thumbs and we have Wi-Fi, so life is good.
Um, Opposable thumbs, not necessarily disposable
Opposable,
thumbs.
yeah, yeah, sorry, sorry.
I don't want to dispose of mine. That'd be the end of my evolutionary advantage.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, put evolution to one side and the development of species to one side.
Mhm.
Just thinking about, your analogy with trees. Um, you seem to subscribe to the idea that there is um there is an essence to being a tree or a particular kind of tree, or an essence to being a star or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
uh, and some instances of those essences are better examples of the essence than others, right? So if you've got to
I don't know if it's necessarily something I don't know if it's necessarily something that I'm making the subjective distinction between, more so than this is how things act regardless of if I think things are better or worse. These are how things act. And the trees that do not reach a certain potential, they die off easier. The ones that reach higher live longer. And then everything in the universe cosmically is drawn to heavier objects, things that are in a sense
yeah,
greater than
yeah,
themselves.
sure. I
Uh,
mean, one
and
one might
and
one might say that something surviving longer than other is a purely arbitrary decision of it being better or whatever. I mean, one can make that claim. Some people might say it's better for things to die sooner rather than later for a variety of reasons. Matter being used more dynamically or whatever, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if you
Mhm.
were a Hindu, you might be, and you were a tree, you'd want the tree to die sooner rather than later so you get back to being a human again or something like that, you know? But
Right.
that aside, um, yeah, I think basically what you've got here is essences and instances, or actuality and potentiality, and you've got this idea of
Yeah.
this infinite potential. Um, I think, I mean, the idea, it seems like a fairly common sense one. Um, everything is everything does seem to be tending towards realizing itself. Some more successfully than others. And as you say, the universe does seem to be made up with um, the things which get bigger seem to be rewarded with a longer existence, I suppose, or whatever. By bigger, I don't just mean in terms of size, but in terms of like manifesting that essence or whatever. The biggest fir tree is the best kind of fir tree, and it gets the most birds' nests, and it gets the most sun, etc., and it lasts longer. Um, I mean, all of that's fine. Um, the reason I mentioned Hegel before, so his idea, which is kind of what connects with this thing about God,
Mhm.
is that, well, before you get to Hegel, I mean, one has to think about Aristotle. So in Aristotle, there was I mean, his concept, which was very popular and became less popular in the 17th to 19th century, and people are talking about it again, is teleology. Um, the idea that in order to explain a thing, you have to include um, what the thing is, if it were what the thing would be if it were a perfect instantiation of itself, right?
Mhm.
So if you want to know what a fir tree is, if you want to know what a dog is or whatever, you have to look at the perfect examples of those things, not at the dog that was born deformed and doesn't have any legs, or the tree that was never able to grow because of overshadows and whatever.
Right.
Um, so the idea is that everything is acting towards realizing itself is the basic idea. Um, but what Hegel and the thing that you would have is if everything is acting towards this ultimate potential, or this ultimate reality, which you might want to call God or whatever, um, it's it's difficult to see how a tree or a carrot or a whatever a fish, how they can all be doing that independently, right? Because I mean, a tree is never going to be conscious, or a tree is never going to walk around. And the minute it becomes the kind of thing that walks around and is conscious and so on, it's no longer a tree, it's something else. That is to
Right.
say that your infinite potential, if it's there, um, implies that everything in the universe, all of creation, as it were, is ultimately is going to end up as one thing, and that this potential to be realized or being self-realized is it's going to happen in some creatures or some things rather than others, right?
Right. There was a really great neuroscientist I enjoyed listening to. I'm trying to find his name right now. He talked about I think he's writing a book about how everything is there are no things, there are only processes. And it's kind of diving into what, yeah, Ian McGilchrist.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with him at all?
The name rings a bell.
Um, yeah, so maybe he's not a neuroscientist.
Oh, this is he's a psychologist. This is the master
Yeah.
and his emissary. Yeah, this is the guy who wrote a very famous book about how the
Yeah.
left side of the brain and the right side of the brain relate to each other and so on.
Right, right. Predator and Pred. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Master and yeah. Um, I listened to a few different interviews that he was in, and he kind of talks about, maybe what his next book is going to be like, and it's something along those lines that there are no things, there are only processes,
Hmm.
and I think that's kind of what you're talking about. I think it might be um, splitting hairs, I guess, to kind of say, is everything one thing or not? And I wouldn't be opposed as to to making that sort of claim that in the end everything is one thing. And I think it kind of lends to there's a really neat theory out there. I think you've definitely heard of it. There's like the what is it, the egg theory or something, and there's a whole little story, a nice little story that goes with it. And it's about this like dad who dies in a car accident and he ends up before God, and God is sort of walking him through his life and telling him everything about what's going on, but it's something along the lines of how everything, like every person is this God um, that is learning to become a god. It's like kind of like a god before it's born or something akin.
Hmm.
Have you heard of it? I think it's called the egg theory or something, maybe. Um, and it's this nice little story about how like everything, like when that guy died in the car accident, and he's like worried about his family and his children at home and what they're gonna do without him. But it's something like the God that's explaining how the universe works to him is something like you're gonna go back in time and be some little girl in India in the 1800s, right? And then
Mm.
after that life, you're gonna go back to being Genghis Khan. And then after that life, you're gonna go into the future and be it's like every life is the same consciousness being lived, so that everything, all the terrible and wonderful things that we do to each other, we're ultimately doing to like the same soul or something
Hmm.
like that, right?
Hmm.
And so I thought it was a really really wonderful idea, and I mean a lot more wonderful than some of the other religions that exist out there in my opinion, and it kind of has this karma-esque element to it, where it's like, well, every terrible thing you do, you're doing to your own soul, you just don't know it yet. And everyone you meet is yourself, so how you treat them, be it good or bad, you're just treating yourself. It's the God treating itself that way. And then you kind of have this. It kind of lends back to things we've talked about before about the teacher and the student, the master and the pupil, where it's like something is egging you on or guiding you to understanding yourself, and that would be something like the parental deity or guiding deity, and it's just kind of helping you along to become what you are meant to be, and that might be something like a god in another world or something, so um, and so the theory is very, it's a nice little story, and and I think it kind of explains, it does a neat job of explaining something like everything being the same thing.
Hmm.
And what I'm kind of expressing here is it's not just people in the story. I forget if the story really says anything more beyond consciousness extending past people and onto animals or plants or things like that.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't be necessarily opposed. I don't really think we understand or know where consciousness comes from. And until we do, I don't know if we can definitively say that cats and trees don't have consciousness. I think we can. Or rocks even. Who knows? Who knows? I think I'm more open to the idea that most living organisms have a consciousness. I think inanimate objects probably don't, but I could be wrong. It could be anything and everything that holds energy from the sun. That's another really interesting and wild idea to wrestle around with too.
Yeah, I think.
You know,
Yeah, I think. I mean, the reason one is going to want to come down on one side or the other to this question is if, I mean, to go back to a very popular person who thinks in this way. I mean, the egg story you're describing is sort of just Hinduism, um, uh, which is a very interesting worldview. But to go back to Hegel, who uses a lot of the sort of words you use, um, although very systematically, um, his understanding is that reality is the self unfolding or the unfolding um, of itself coming to know itself.
yeah,
Um, so that is to say, he conceives of history as a linear process with a beginning and an end. And at the end, the universe will know itself, or everything will be realized. I mean, quite what this looks like, I mean, I don't know, but um, that sort of system will work only if you have what's called a sort of a holism, this idea that everything is essentially is it deep down a single organic unity. If you conceive of the world too mechanistically and see just separate kinds with no real, with absolute distinction from one another, um, it would be difficult to see how they can then be the kinds of thing which are tending towards this end, this final state. Um, because if history is linear, well, the final state doesn't exist yet. Um, and it's not clear how it can be pulling them if they're not already part of it. And if they're already part of it, well, then everything's already part of it. Therefore, everything's the same thing, right?
Right. And I think we only I think we only sort of segment creatures and separate mammals from plants and from amphibians to crustaceans, et cetera, to try and sort of like Marduk chopping up time and kind of organizing chaos into bits and pieces that we can chew on easier one at a time.
Mhm.
And so there is utility in that because it's a lot to throw at somebody and then I think it's easier to kind of take in chunks. But I totally agree with you, and I think ultimately evolution has been a great evidence of that, right? Because like I was saying before, and again with the whole idea that Jordan Peterson kind of ascribes with the serotonin system, is this serotonin system has lasted 400 million years and is something we share with 400 million years worth of creatures on this planet, dating back to these underwater living creatures, right? So, and in that is something that all of this biology on this planet shares in a very interesting and intricate way. And so I think that lends to what you're saying is that everything is sort of one thing moving together towards something greater, and it's constantly doing that. And as we look back in time, we see that. It's just hard to see where it's going to go into the future, etc. But I think there's a lot of evidence, especially in earthly biology, for that. So
Yeah, I think and I mean if you think about the universe beginning, if it does begin then at the Big Bang, you've got everything all squished into one, you know, sort of potency without space, and
yeah,
expands, and from that single point comes everything. I mean, it's not hard to conceive of everything as ultimately this single reality, even if it's materially distinct.
right.
And so here we get into part of the problem that people would have is even though everything is materially distinct, there does seem to be a unity to them. But the unity isn't a material thing, right?
It's something like gravity.
Something like gravity. So, I mean, that would be one way of putting it. Yeah, so, I mean, it's a relational thing. But I wonder if you want, I mean, if it has to be something deeper than that you do end up needing to posit if you're going to have your this infinite potential stuff, you're going to have some sort of soul or immaterial
Well, right. It's
principle,
almost
formal
maybe
principle of
maybe gravity is sort of the tool or the messenger, um, but it's not there is something like a master of it, right?
right.
Maybe something at the end of gravity because gravity is pulling everything towards something, right? And so there has to be maybe that is something like a consciousness that is pulling everything back to what it was at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just shooting throwing
yeah, I
darts.
mean, I guess what you I think if one wants to what if one's going to posit a sort of ultimate reality or a sort of an end to, and I mean end in this technical sense as in purpose, as in
Yeah.
that for which things are working towards. Um, if there is such a thing, and a single one, an ultimate one at the end, um, oddly enough, the end at the end of time, um, then yeah, I guess that is in a sense the master of the whole show of what we can call creation in that way, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, but for all that, one is still going to want to have distinctions, and so you might want to say that um, the way in which the universe, so you don't have to say that there is this ultimate reality and it is distributing itself through everything in the same ways.
Hmm.
It might be that only certain parts of the universe, say, express consciousness, and they are the consciousness of the universe, right?
Yeah.
But you and I presumably are conscious. Obviously, animals are to varying degrees and so on, and self-conscious and all that. I'm not sure about plants and bricks. I doubt it. But that we are the principles of um, consciousness in the universe, and therefore we have a particular and a special part to play. There's a thing in the book I mentioned to you a little while ago called the Zhuangzi, in which he talks about when the wind blows through a forest,
Yeah.
and you start to hear all the different whistles. That's when the wind is blowing through the holes in the trees, in the bark and the trunks and so on, da da da.
Yeah.
And that creates music. And so that we human beings are the little holes through which the wind, or in your analogy, the gravity, sort of creates a sound when it moves through it and a music.
Right.
Um, and so that there's a sort of particular value about being human. There is a value in being a goldfish or a pineapple, but there's a particular value in being human in that we're the ones through which this infinite potential can know itself, which presumably is what it wants to do. I mean, otherwise, why would it exist at all?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so, I mean, that's a fairly standard idea of the kind of thing that you've got going, is that we human beings are part of this giant cosmic picture and a very special part. Um, and that in our knowing the material universe around us, and then also having insight into the spiritual or metaphysical, whatever, eventually we will get to a stage, so the idea would be, that we will properly understand the universe,
Yeah.
what people call the enlightenment or nirvana or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Um, and that is your infinite potential. And so in Christianity, I mean, the idea of heaven isn't having nice meals and going to the park with your family forever. It's
Right.
seeing God, the supreme being, and knowing him as he knows himself. So seeing God face, that's the image they use, is seeing God face to face. Um, that would be what your ultimate potential or infinite potential, I think, has to be, right? In the end.
Sort of. I think we have to be careful to. I think the distinction between knowing God as oneself and reaching for the infinite potential that is God is that one sort of ascribes. I think. I think if you tell someone who hasn't lived something akin to that experience that when they see God, they will see themselves. There's a sort of uh, uh, ego that can be easily um, described there. I think most people, when you tell them something like that, they're going to go, "Oh, well, I am God." And I think what the difference in in that idea and its utility, those are two separate things ultimately. But even though I think you're sort of right, I think the difference is in the idea that there is an infinite potential. It's like you will never you may never the universe may never get to something that is
Yeah.
perfect because it can always be better. And I think good examples of this would be something akin to um, you know, describe your perfect day right now, right? And then if I read you what you describe your perfect day is, that you say today, 2 months from now, you might come up with better ideas for what that perfect day might look like, right? You might be like, well, I missed this and that, right? So now the perfect day improved by a small margin, but it improved. And then I might ask you 2 years from now what a perfect day to you looks like. And it may be completely different or it may be very similar, but you might have thought up one or two things that might make it better, right? And then if I ask you what the perfect day is 10 years from now, again, it might be something very, very close, 90% the same, but you might have thought of a few more things, because you're constantly learning and you're constantly becoming hopefully you're constantly becoming a better version of yourself, or at least you're learning, whether you know it or not. So you know the ideal that we strive towards is something we are always uh, subservient to, and I think that's why it has this traditional idea of a god that you are subservient to. You're right. It has that more of a traditional feel to it, and I think that's something that comes out in the older archetypes very well. Because I think when you tell man that he is God, at the end of the day, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if man is not subservient to anything, he easily deforms himself into this tyrannical monster. And we see that time and time again with many men who rise to sort of that absolute power and do terrible things. So um, I think I think that's why I make such a clear distinction as far as the infinite potential and making sure that there's this sort of subservience to it, because I think that's ultimately what calls you forth. That's what calls you to be better, is knowing that you can always be better, right? And I think if you tell people that what lives on the other on the other side of God, when God has his back to you and he finally turns around and it's just like looking in a mirror, I think if you tell people before they're ready that truth, that they it leads down a very dark path. And I don't think the majority of people are ready to hear that, or and largely because they won't understand it fully and properly. And also to the image of God, when they talk about beings that see God, it's something like a blinding light. It's something like it's so bright, or something that you can't bear to look at it, right? And I think that also leans to the idea of infinite potential, because if it's just you on the other side of God, well, you can look at yourself. You look at yourself every day when you get up and get yourself ready for the day. Um, but the idea of
Well,
something
do
of the
you? I mean,
idea
is
that
that true? Is that right? I mean, it's sort of question begging, isn't it?
well,
Because the argument would be that you don't actually see yourself. You see a creation of an errant mental process. You see yourself fundamentally, you see yourself as somehow crucially distinct from everything around you. You interpret yourself according to limited thinking. It said it's unenlightened thinking, and that's part of the point of life, right? Um, I mean, I can see your Lutheran background is actually very strong, and that
it's
even in
but it's
heaven,
old.
you.
It's the thing is older than just Lutheran. I think that the idea of God being this blinding thing that you can't really look at is something older than just Christianity. But the
Oh, I
truth
didn't
in
say
it is
Christianity.
that
I said
the the,
Lutheran.
the,
Uh,
the truth in it is that the truth in it is that when you look at everything you can become, there that is there is a yin and a yang in that can be very pessimistic and that can be very optimistic, right? There's two sides to that coin. Knowing that you can be better means that you are not better, that you have failed and or made mistakes in some way. And I think a lot of people get caught up on that too much. that they want to avoid the idea of something like an infinite potential or God altogether, because it's easier. They think that it's easier to just accept yourself, but the truth is you'd never accept yourself, because there is always something that you can be doing that is better. And the more you avoid that, the more you do so to your peril. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the very beginning, that when you align your life with certain principles, you end up living a happier, better life, oddly enough. And the people that avoid these kinds of principles and action and behavior end up living less fulfilled lives. And a lot of that is very well documented psychologically, and it's very interesting because it kind of points. I don't think it points in the direction that society or culture necessarily wants to be going at the moment, as far as what they say they want, but actions speak louder than words, I guess you could say. So there was another point I wanted to make there. But the positive end, here's the other part. The positive end of that coin is that you can be better, right? So the negative end is that there's things that you could be doing that you're not doing properly, and the other negative end of it, or maybe the suffering of life, is kind of the fact that you will never reach that infinite potential. But the knowing that there is space to improve also has a positive end to it as well, right? Because wherever you are right now in life, right, wherever you think those mistakes are being made, or life is kind of sucks, or what have you, things can always be better. There's room for improvement. There's no glass ceiling, right? So you can always improve and become better. And so there's a yin and a yang to that. Whereas the idea that you are this manifestation completely whole as you are, as the infinite being of consciousness that is the universe, comes with it this sense of completeness that isn't true to your being. It's not true to how you act. It's not true to how you think. So although there's a partial truth to it, you have to be careful who you're telling that to, because most people aren't ready for it. Most people are not. They haven't reached that point yet, and it's lacking the subservience that is necessary to grow. Right? There's a really another good way to envision this was something I learned from an old late and great Aikido sensei who he passed away a few years ago. I really respect this guy, Lionel Ramonzo, out of the Chicago and Wisconsin area. He was a really great sensei, and he said something like, "You can't learn anything from if your cup is full. You have to, if your cup is full, you every time you try to pour something new in, it'll just spill out. So, and if you want to learn something new, you have to pour from you have to make some space. You have to empty your cup a bit before you pour something new in. And so to that sense, I think telling people that they are this ultimate manifestation of God, and it's almost like you're telling them you are the manifestation of something that is infinite potential, and you have nowhere to go. You're putting a glass ceiling on them, and it's like, well, no, and that doesn't help them live their life any better, or be any happier. Usually, people get very not only egotistical and tyrannical and devolve into that, but they're full of emptiness and shallowness and voidness, and kind of devolve into something that's not as fulfilling. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, what you're saying, it doesn't mean it's not true, that we are not all this single reality coming to know itself God thing.
Right.
What you're saying is it wouldn't be helpful for people to hear that.
Yes.
Well, that may or may not be true. Um, uh, I think obviously the Buddha told people that, and I think I don't think he can be criticized for telling people that they don't have to improve a great deal in this life.
Well,
Um,
I think he was someone that ran away from responsibility. If you listen to the story of Siddhartha very well, he ran away from his responsibility as a father, as a king,
yeah,
to become a Jainist monk, and then he failed at that and couldn't fast like the rest of them. So he sort of made his own hodgepodge, watered down version of Jainism. and then was worshipped and glorified for all that. So I think there are issues I have, although there may be things I agree with the Buddha. I think he is someone that is not.
But what's your
I
criticism
don't
of him
know.
then? Surely he's accomplished quite a great feat. He's been a failure and become an incredible pan-historical, titan. I mean, that seems to be a tremendous accomplishment. Um, he went down rather than up the way you would want to go, but he got to the same place, right? Ended up higher than everyone else. Um,
I think if he could have gotten higher by going back and being a father to his child. I think that was something that it was a fatal flaw in the Buddha slash Siddhartha story. I don't think running away and not being a father to your child is worthy of praise. Again, there's room to improve. That's sort of my point, is that there's always room to improve. So if you want to look at Buddha as some sort of manifestation of someone who saw the face of God within himself, I'm going to tell you he didn't look deep enough. He didn't look low enough. He had ways to improve, and he should have, after the lessons he had to learn, he never went back to fulfill his role as a man and as a father. He's continued to be the monk he was. So he didn't complete his hero's journey. I don't know if he's a good example.
well, I mean, he obviously thought he was. I mean, that's the difficulty, isn't it? I mean, you've got a standard of code. I mean, there are lots of people that Taoism's a bit daft if you're a Confucian, and that kind of thing, and the Cynics were terrible if you were, or Epicureans are terrible if you're a Stoic. I mean, you might have set of moral code or moral standards and say this is what a person should do um, as a consequence of what they are.
Right.
Um, People like the Buddha or Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi or whatever. Um, I mean, they would counter that by saying that well, your position isn't going to lead to happiness for anyone. Um, uh, and secondly, that there is no reason to hold to your position. I mean, why should Buddha hang around and look after his children?
Because he
Um,
had them.
but is that
Because
well?
it's good for the children. There's plenty of psychological evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, there are
That
things in which
stuff
you
is
can
like
say
that stuff is
that,
like
but if
crystal
he
clear. That
doesn't care about them, or if he thinks, well, that's all well and good, but if I just do what all the other parents have ever done, I will, as psychology has seems to have demonstrated in history, just perpetuate the cycle of miserable people. I've got to break out of this uh, and not give people a temporary respite from the misery of the Dharma wheel and all that stuff. I've got to get them out of that cycle permanently by piercing through to ultimate reality or whatever. Now,
Well, I think a lot of it.
he might say he's doing a better job, and if he has secured, I mean, if it's true or not, I'm not a Buddhist, but if it's true that thousands or maybe millions of people have been released from a cycle of misery and become enlightened and all that sort of stuff, then he's got lots more children who he has saved, although he didn't necessarily achieve the standard of moral goodness that you think he ought to have achieved.
Well, I think because in order to the moral kind of morality he has to make has to fit something that he has lived, and what he has lived is abandoning his children and his position as a king, and so I think it's an easy thing to sell to people that want to abandon their children and abandon their position in life to ascribe to some sort of mediocre version of happiness. Um, there are truths that I will agree with Buddha, like I said before, but I think even in his story there is an infinite potential better Buddha that he could have become. And there may be better examples that are similar to Buddha, but I know from studying the story of Siddhartha, I know that I don't really agree with how he lived his life in action. So I don't know if I really care for some of what he has to say,
Yeah.
as
Well, I
critical as
wouldn't
that
worry
as
about it.
critical as that might
I don't think
sound.
you're going to upset him. He's quite happy wherever he is.
Maybe who knows? But I think um, what was I gonna say? Oh, so what you were saying was you were kind of ripping into people who are not happy in marriages and everything, or raising their children. And if you want some of my thoughts on that, those of you who are still listening, we've kind of been going for a while here. I do dive into a little bit of that within the sexual arena theory podcast. So I would go check that out. I plan on doing one more so where I really just lay it out plainly. Maybe it's just me on the mic by myself. That way, because a lot of people were kind of jumping in and sort of saying, "Well, I don't agree with that," and we kind of would challenge it back and forth with on the podcast. So maybe I'll do a video where I just kind of clearly lay that out. So look for the sexual arena theory videos if you wanted me to hear me go deeper into this, but. I don't think that I think that the psychological evidence is very clear for children. First off, that abandoning them is not good. You need both biological parents there to raise the kid, and the evidence there is crystal clear. And the argument that Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, their whole revolutionary road thing is how all marriages devolve into. It's completely inaccurate, and a terrible thing to ascribe to something like marriage. A marriage is not perfect by any means. And I describe a lot of the reasons why there is this inconsistency in most relations sexually between men and women and all that jazz in the sexual arena theory quite a bit. And I think you've listened to that at least somewhat. So I think it's far more complicated than just I'm going to run away and become a Jane and attempt to fast and this and that. But because I think there are very, very important things to learn in the roles of having a significant other and having children. And I think to dispense with attachment entirely is to ignore your primal instinct to sex. It's to ignore everything that has come before you that has made you. I don't think we are creatures that are meant to repress things like that. And I think that's where when we repress things like attachment, we that's where you find some of the horrors of the world. I think people who repress sex are more often to be aggressive. I think they are more often to be abusive. I think they're more often to commit things like rape and pedophilia. I think that's very, very clear in the Catholic end of things, the Catholic end of the spectrum in religion. And so I think you cannot dispense with such a primal force like sex and emotion. I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with these ideas of joy is without attachment. Now, I do think there is a partial truth to that. I think some of the truth comes in we often create a lot of suffering for ourselves by with expectation. So I think there's a nugget of truth there that when you kind of lower your expectancy of things, you can eliminate a lot of the suffering of things. You can eliminate a lot of your personal suffering. Expectations are the crux of a lot of suffering, no matter what your status is in life. You could be the richest man in the world or the poorest man in the world. It doesn't matter if you expect something to happen and it doesn't, and you were pitting everything on that one thing. That can really, definitely lead you down quite the spiral. So yeah, so there is some truth to that, but I don't think that means abandoning your children or abandoning your position in marriage necessarily. I think there's a lot of important things you can learn in marriage that you will not otherwise learn. And here's for an example, I guess something of an example or an argument for marriage and the role of marriage in a person's life. is that the contract, and it must be a contract, it cannot be a boyfriend girlfriend thing, okay, is that you're saying to someone else, no matter what, through thick and thin, okay, they go through the whole spiel in the most of the marital vows, I'm not going anywhere, okay, and that is a very powerful thing for growth and development, because when things get tough, when someone challenges you or strikes a chord that you don't like, right? You can always walk away. And I think the ability to walk away from something that offends you, from something that is sort of adversarial or conflicting towards you, the ability to just walk away means the ability to um, to not grow, to kind of stand still. And I have a whole other theory that nothing really stands still. I don't really believe that things do. Things either are spiraling upwards or spiraling downwards, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But we can get into that a different time. Um, I think that having someone who is there, who's going to nitpick at you for right or wrong about all of the things you could improve on, is going to put you into, you have two choices then. You either have to live with this person and you are just going to be stubborn and you are not going to change, and they are not going to like that you're not going to change, and you're both going to hate each other. So you choose to live in resentment, or you choose to change to make a better version of yourself, right? And you can't get that in any other social relationship, because you can always leave. Parent doesn't says and it picks on you for something trivial that might end up making you a more sociable person or better person or what have you. You can walk away. You can ignore them. You can avoid their calls. You don't have to go see them. Same thing with the boyfriend girlfriend. You can always just be like, all right, well, this is over. All right, you want to sit there and oh, you don't like that, don't take the garbage out every 3 days, I'm just gonna go, you're gonna nitpick at me about that, or oh, you don't like the way I spend my money, blah blah blah, I'm just gonna break up with you, right? And I'm gonna continue my poor spending habits. Things like that. You can always walk away from a friendship or a regular dating relationship, family members, all that stuff. But a marriage is something that it's something that is it's a deeper contract that says I'm not going anywhere, okay? um, so that ultimately is going to help you become a better person. It's also somebody that will develop. It's sort of that one person you can always trust, because again, there's going to be times in a marriage where you hate the other person and you're going to say some of the truest and harshest things to them that they don't want to hear, and they may hate you for the rest of their life, right? But that is going to give you someone in life that you can always be, no matter what, you can always be honest with them and true to them, even if it means saying the most terrible things sometimes. And that often does happen in marriages. And some marriages end, some of your marriages end because of those things, right? It gets so bad, they're like, all right, we're going to get a divorce, you know? So I think there is a lot of utility in something like marriage, beyond the obvious, right? Beyond the whole, you get to have children and the pleasure of sex and all that kind of stuff. There's things beyond that build your character in ways that if you are left on your own to sit in a pile of Cheeto puff dust on your shirt and jerking off to whatever porn and just being the lazy piece of crap that everybody longs to be on their own, there's a better version of you that lives on the other side of a long-term partner that you make a serious oath to. And there's a lot of utility in that. And to dispense with that, to sort of achieve that sort of, I'm going to sit and am on my couch and just binge watch Netflix all alone and feel sorry for myself while I jerk off to Pornhub. It's like, okay, well, that's nice, but I'm sure we could all do that at many times in our life, but that's not going to call the better version of yourself to being. And then with children, and there's many things I can go into with children. And so, I think children are an infinite, when you treat them right, they are an infinite source of joy and wonder. They are an infinite source of nostalgia. That it's kind of like and rediscovery, nostalgia and rediscovery are kind of like the same thing there. they also can offer new ways of thinking and new ways of exploring and especially in today's environment where things are constantly changing. I mean, I'm able to teach my parents a lot about how to use technology and things like that that they otherwise wouldn't know. But children are an infinite source of all sorts of wonderful things if you treat them properly. I think if you don't treat them so well, it's things it'll be rough, but and it's also gives you another perspective on who you were to your parents, and it gives you a new sound sense of appreciation for your parents after you become a parent yourself, because you see what they had to deal with. They had to deal with you and all your inconsistencies and your annoyances and mistakes and this and that, and they took the time to raise you properly or and whatnot. So and the difficulties and challenges that comes with. There's a lot of challenges in marriage, and there's a lot of challenges in parenting, but those are the kinds of challenges that we need to become better people. And I think we dispense with those sort of things to our own demise. And that's the one thing I would probably disagree with the Buddha on.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have a set of values that you're I think very robust in advocating and defending. I mean, I wonder if, I mean, some of it does seem to be a little bit arguing in a circle. Um, uh, you know, this is good. This is how it's achieved. Ergo, that proves that parenting is good because you get good children and you want good children.
I don't
Because
know. I don't know. Good. I think we can dispense with good or bad.
Well,
I think,
valuable then. I mean, but
I think you
the issue
dispense
would
with.
be that you, if one wants to criticize someone like the Buddha or someone who does that for not walking the path which you have found to be useful,
Childhood
and maybe you're right
psychology
to.
is
I'm
found.
not.
Childhood psychology. I would say childhood psychology has found this out. This isn't a Zacharigolis thing. This isn't
Yeah, but who
a
cares?
me belief. This is something that scientifically we have gone out and proven, and you can look at any stats around the world that children without one of their parents or both without both biological parents in the picture, regardless of how much
Oh,
they
sure,
argue,
sure,
etc., they
sure,
do better across the board. So.
but why should we? Why should we necessarily one? I mean, that can be true, but one, does it necessarily matter? I mean, that's a contestable point. Two, is it a higher value than what might be achieved by going into the wilderness or the abyss, looking at the abyss, all that kind of thing, where you might be able to see the world from a wider and a truer perspective. Um, if you have different perspectives, I mean, I mean, what's to say that your one is right? That this value in having well brought up children, etc., etc. I mean, who cares, right?
I
I mean, this
think
is the
you
question.
because
Does the
I think you
from the
can.
perspective of this infinite potential,
Mm,
right? Does it matter to the infinite potential, whatever that is,
mm.
that, some people are excelling very well, some people aren't doing very well, some people are faster growing than others, some people are very slow, some people die having achieved everything they could have achieved, as much as they could to a maximum degree. Some people didn't. Does it matter to the infinite perspective? And indeed, is it not necessary that there be those? This is your yin yang thing. Is it not necessary for there to be good parents that there be bad parents? Is it not necessary that there are people who live good lives and people who live bad lives, or people who live successful lives and unsuccessful lives? Um, and that is all to say, then, from the infinite perspective, infinite potentials perspective, there is no value distinction between how how you would live your life and how the Buddha's lived his.
I think there's a clear distinction in what works and what is better for the progress
Oh, sure,
of
I'm
the
accepting that.
of the
That's
process,
we've
and
admitted
and and
that.
there
But the
are
question is, does it matter?
I said earlier that evolution is constantly doing experiments, and it's not that it's stuck in one set or form. It's just constantly adding to instinct and tradition and this sort of set knowledge that we pass on to the future constantly. That is growing and excelling and becoming better over very long periods, very, 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 very long periods of time. So and evolution is just a wide example of that. So, or one of the greatest evidences that we have for that existing. And but it's not to say I'm not saying that bad experiments don't happen. Bad experiments happen all the time, and we learn and the cosmic process or the biological human process, the biological earthly process, everything is constantly learning from those bad experiments as far as what not to carry on into the future, what not to pass on into the future. And I think that's widely relevant to any child that's had a bad parent. They are learning. I think a large part of their development is unlearning things that they were sort of they had to live, right? And looking at what they experienced and lived as a way of not being. And that is their form of learning how to be, right? It's doing the opposite of what they experienced that they obviously didn't like. I think almost everybody does that in some form of parenting. If their parent annoyed them, from a slight annoyance to the largest forms of abuse that you can imagine. I think everyone is sort of picking at their parents, going, "These are the things I liked. These are the things I didn't like," and carrying that into how they treat their children to the best of their ability. Right? Nothing is perfect. These things are not like so cut and dry or black and white. But over the long periods, over very, very, very thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, these processes are getting better and better and better, and we are creatures that are ever evolving in a process that's ever going forward. So, and there is a distinction between what I'm describing and what the Buddha did, and I would also purport or say that what the Buddha found, you can still find in life either before, probably not before, but either before you have children or well after your children have grown up and gone on to become adults. Then you have time to stare into the abyss and think about everything and anything there is to think about. But he had children. He had a wife, right? He had this position and this role that he sort of had to play, and he ran away from all that. He ran away from responsibility, right? For again, what I would sort of call this mediocre, oddly repressed form of existence. And then you want to call that joy. It's like, I don't know. I look at anybody that's sort of there, and I think of them more like they are in this fantasy world. What's that? What's the one? The island in, I think it's the Iliad, where they're sort of all in an illusion. I feel like it's more like that. I think it's more like you're more of those people, especially the ones that I see and talk to in my subjective life, in mass. The kind of people that think that way often get lost in things like doing too much, smoking too much weed, and doing too much acid. And so they're kind of pursuing this illusory stillness, but it's not true, because you when you are avoiding responsibility, it's just going to build, and that becomes a repressed monster that comes knocking at your door eventually, going, "Time's up, man." And that comes for everybody in one form or another. Whatever you're repressing, whatever you're putting to the side and saying, "I'll do that tomorrow," it's going to come for you at one point or another. So striving for the better version of yourself allows it not only makes that creature smaller and smaller and smaller and something easier to deal with every day, but it ultimately calls forth a better, stronger version of yourself in every form. So, so that's something. I mean, there's a lot of things that I agree with on the Buddha. I just think that, again, looking at his story and then looking at some of the things he says, I don't know if I agree with the whole idea of dispensing with everything that is the material world to pursue this sort of infinite meditation. I don't know if that's the ultimate truth. I think there's a lot of truth to be learned through lived experience, and a lot of that is natural, right? Like, I don't think repressing sexual instinct is good for people. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of examples of that. So I don't I think there are a lot of things that are important to live, and to understand and to grow from, that are normal. They are normal for 9 out of 10 people. I think the person that spends his time in the woods meditating for his whole life is an anomaly. I don't think most people live that existence. Why? Because we all want to have sex after puberty. Okay, so that's I and again, I think there's a time and a place for all that. I think there is still a time in life where those things, where you can think about those things, right? I mean, I'm thinking about them right now, man, I'll be 27 here soon. I got a birthday this month, and so I'm very young, and I've had time to think about these things, and I have two children, and so it's like, but I also don't party. I also don't, I don't sit and smoke a lot of weed and do all this acid and everything. It's like I sit and I think about these more complex things. I don't waste my time with some of these other things. And I don't say that to be critical, because I think most people doing that, it's normal, right? It's kind of normal. You're exploring, you're experimenting, you're making mistakes to kind of understand what's right, and or not know what's right, but what is useful, what will serve you in the future, and what won't. And a lot of people have to make those mistakes. They don't learn through observational learning, and they don't, or very well, right? They don't most people don't utilize their time properly. And I even fail in that regard every time I pick up the PlayStation controller and play too many video games. Okay, so everyone has their form of distraction and illusion. But I think there is a time and a place, and you can have your cake and eat it too, if you want to live the life of Buddha pursuing truth. But when you have children, you have a responsibility to that. And I don't think avoiding that responsibility is doing you or doing anyone any sort of favors. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way to put it right at the end, doing anyone favors. I mean that, well, I mean even that I'm sure Buddhists would argue with, but um yeah, I mean I think you've definitely got a worldview. Um I mean
I
I
mean,
personally I'm not so sure. Um
do you think that the Buddha could not have done everything he had done if he had either stayed, been a good father, made sure his I don't know if he had a son or a daughter, or whatnot, but if his children were well developed by the age of maybe puberty, or 18, or adulthood maybe, or something like that, and then he'd gone on to his adventures, you don't think that that would have been a good thing, or after his adventures he would have returned and then tried to have been a good father? You don't think that he could have done any of that? You think that he had to have disavowed his role as father and husband and king to learn all these things
um
entirely, or couldn't have put it off until it was a more appropriate time to then leave and go off and discover and face the abyss?
I mean I think I mean here's the rub of the issue is that I think he it seems couldn't because he didn't. I mean, I never knew him personally. It's not necessarily the case that one couldn't. Obviously, Zen
Right.
Buddhism comes along and Chan Buddhism in China, and they're very concerned to um, make Buddhism compatible with the sort of Confucian worldview you seem to have about being able to look after the parents, fitting in properly within the social order of, um, doing all the right things, your social roles and so on. And so they sort of create, by necessity, I suppose, sort of spontaneous enlightenment. And so
Sure.
just by little poems and thinking, you get Zen Buddhism and you have the idea that you can be like you, or like me, I suppose, living a fairly normal life and still achieve what the Buddha achieved. So within Buddhism, within the Buddhist tradition, there's that recognition.
Right.
I think that for him, and I'm conscious of time. It's half 11, and I can hear the person who's living downstairs from me yawning loudly. They obviously are trying to do some important meditation. But uh, um, that particular individual, this man, he lived the life he lived, and I'm something of a determinist in some ways and not in others. And he did what he had to do to live his life. I'm not necessarily as sure as you are that there is a straightforward, objective set of moral. Well, I think there is objective moral truths or values or whatever. Um, but that everyone can relate to them the same way, etc., etc. I'm not so sure that's the case. I'm also not sure, given your wider view of your sort of metaphysical concept of this progression towards the infinite potential,
Yeah.
that your worldview demands that everyone do the things you actually, when you start talking about day-to-day life, you want them to do. I'm not sure everyone needs to have children, or everyone needs to have,
Not at
um,
all. No, not
or
not.
that, or even
Yeah.
that, or even that there's something. I mean, obviously, there's something wrong about abandoning your children and going off and doing your own thing. Let's keep in mind that these children were, very wealthy and so on. So we'll keep that there. Um, uh, though, as you say, psychological studies show wealth isn't everything in the rearing of children. I mean, we have the royal family to prove that. Um,
Right.
uh, but I'm not sure that one can just straightforwardly, or one should straightforwardly say that this wasn't a good thing for this guy to have done within the context of the life he lived, within the context of who he was. I think what is interesting just listening to you, is you definitely seem to have, I mean, I can categorize you basically, I think, into a sort of general tradition. Um, and Hegel increasingly works well because he also, like you, I think, has an authoritarian tendency or a paternalistic tendency, which I approve of. I think that's great. Um, but you definitely seem to have a concept of an essence of a good life, of a good person, that human beings are particular kind of things who ought to try and achieve. I mean, it can be very wide looking, wide ranging, but they should achieve certain things. Like, for example, I'm sure you would say, and I'm sure you're right to say things like human beings shouldn't be morbidly obese, which is no longer a very popular thing to say, as I understand it. But, there is just a way human beings should be. And so your ethics is very biological. And in that sense, you're very Aristotelian. Um, uh, but I think the question I would have in a lot of postmodern people, and I'm not particularly postmodern, but lots of postmodern people would have,
Mhm.
is they would want to say, well, how are you getting your ought from your is? The Hume question. How are you doing that? And others then might say, and why? And so an more interesting maybe discussion to have another time, which I can be a bit more fluent in, is this question of the origins of value and
Yeah.
and the I mean I think part of the problem for your system would be that actually there doesn't seem to be a universal perspective from which you can get to absolute or universal moral rules. Now, I mean that's a huge debate to have, but
I
there's
think
lots of
I
interest.
think we can derive I think we can derive one sort of truth from the evidence that we have compiled in the last hundred over a little over 100 years from the realm of psychology, and that is when you inseminate a woman and get her pregnant, you
You
have
should look after the children.
you have you have a responsibility to that child, and if you don't, then you can and you don't inseminate any woman, and you want to go off and maybe you still have sex, but you're not
You are
getting
hard
them.
and fast to
You're
defend this principle. I
you
mean,
are
it
well.
is
Hey,
a
no, hey, you pull out, you're good, man. You can go be the Buddha and do great things and teach many children and many other people's children and discover these truths. But I do think the evidence of psychology and biology is in fact clear. It's as clear as the morality behind like murder and theft. It's like don't do that. It's like yeah, don't like what you said before. You sort of admitted to what I'm saying here, and that is don't abandon your children. I don't think that's I don't think I think most people would argue in favor of that moral that as a moral bad or a moral mistake, and staying and sticking around and being a part of your child's life is a moral good. And much of psychology and biology has gone on to prove that. Many crime statistics have gone on to prove that. Educational grade systems gone on to prove that. So who knows if I'm not really familiar with the history of Siddhartha's child, but who knows that without, for as many people as he may have helped or blessed, the son may have gone on to be a tyrant king and killed, simply because he didn't have a father. And I'm not saying that that happened. I'm not familiar with it whatsoever, but this is also this is the yin and yang of that choice. And so I think that, I'm not trying to make a cookie cutter case. I think that there are plenty of great people that still come from very difficult circumstances. Maybe they were not, maybe they didn't have a mother or a father when they grew up, and they go on to be very great, wonderful, amazing people. But the some of the evidence of what I'm saying is more in, it's not an absolute truth. It's just more in favor of what I'm describing. So when something is 80 to 90% of the time, or when it works 80 to 90% of the time, I don't think it's worth throwing away or throwing out. So I think those are the kinds of rules that we should pass on and sort of teach the next generation. So things that work 80 to 90% of the time. So I think abandoning your child doesn't, it only maybe only works 10,
Yeah.
20% of the time. So
I mean,
why would you teach people that,
I
So
think, I mean, the Buddha would just come back to you. I mean, what you've got here is you're saying that it's good that children have healthy lives and become healthy, good, productive people who are able to achieve their potential. That's the basic premise, I think, of your position. And you're
yeah,
saying psychology has shown that the two parents is the best way, or the stable family is the way to achieve that. Now, that can be true, but
mm,
that doesn't get you to anyone has a moral obligation to that reality. I mean, it might be true that this is the best way in order to achieve this outcome, but if people disagree with you that that outcome is the best outcome, or they disagree with you that that outcome is one that can't be sacrificed for the sake of a greater good or whatever, um, I mean, you're not going to get away from that. So, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it is, I think people should raise their children properly. I mean, I had a single parent, and I think it would have been better. Well, it would have been better, especially for some of my siblings. But I won't get into that. But it would have been better if the parents had taken responsibility and managed their situation, etc., etc.
yeah,
Um, so I'm with you on the fact of the fact of the matter, but I think you're overestimating as it were, the metaphysical or the meta-ethical strength of your moral injunction. I'm not saying it's wrong, uh, but I think the Buddha or people of that ilk could have a lot of things to say, um, uh, questioning your premises and so on. And maybe one of the ways in which they would do that is they would go back to this basic sort of natural ethics you've sort of got, this sort of common sense, perfectly plausible Aristotelianism kind of thing, and say, well, actually, the world doesn't look the way you think it does. And I don't have the relationship to the world you think I do, nor do you, etc., etc. And
yeah.
there's a lot of things people would do, but we will have to save that for another time, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been great speaking to you.
Yeah, to all of our listeners, we'll definitely have to do this again. Thank you for listening in, and have a good one.